Saludos, amigos de Colombia, de Virginia en Estados Unidos. Soy Everett Worthington y es un honor para mí hablarles hoy. Hoy soy colombiano. Okay, as you can tell from my Spanish, it's not really good enough to really pass myself off as a Colombian, even for a day. But it is my honor to speak to you today on behalf of my good friend, Andrea Ortega Bichara. I was privileged to visit Cartagena and Bogota a few years back at the invitation of Andrea, and I fell in love with your country. So I'm very happy to speak with you today about forgiveness. Now, I know that you have had many conflicts over the last 60 years, and I know that for some of you that represents many losses and griefs and feelings of betrayal and offenses that you've experienced and people that you have known and loved have experienced. And my heart goes out to you for those struggles. I'm not really a complete stranger to those struggles myself. I experienced the loss of my mother to a brutal murder and a sexual violation. And my brother, who found my mother's body, was traumatized, and 10 years afterwards, he committed suicide as a result of post-traumatic stress disorder from that experience. So, although forgiveness is never easy, I was able to forgive the young man who murdered my mother. And over time, I was even able to forgive myself for not doing all that I thought that I should have been able to do as a clinical psychologist to help my brother avoid committing suicide and deal with his post-traumatic stress disorder. So I know that forgiveness is a very hard thing to do. Andrea is conducting a public awareness campaign to help the people in Colombia become aware that forgiveness is one option for handling wrongs and hurts and betrayals and offenses that we experience. She hopes to make people aware that forgiving can positively help relationships that have been damaged by the offense. It's true that you might not be able to fully reconcile with the person who might have harmed you, but especially if you don't feel that you can trust that person. But you can make a sincere decision to forgive the person. By that I mean to decide to treat the person differently as a more valuable and valued person. And that might make it easier to reduce the amount of resentment or hurt or anger or hate even that you might feel. And so that is a second type of forgiveness that we call emotional forgiveness. So there actually are two types of forgiveness: decisional forgiveness, making that decision to treat the person different, and emotional forgiveness. Now, it might be that you might never be able to reconcile with the person, especially if they're not willing to be trustworthy, but you can forgive. Well, making a decision to forgive is, and experiencing emotional forgiveness is also beneficial to you in other ways besides just improving relationships. It can actually help you with your mental health. So making a decision to forgive and experiencing emotional forgiveness can reduce the amount of depression that you might feel. It can reduce the amount of anxiety. It can reduce the amount of stress. It can reduce the obsessive rumination that we often do when we've been hurt. And it does reduce the mental health problems and increase our sense of psychological well-being because it reduces the amount of rumination that we do. So we don't keep rehearsing and bringing anew the feelings of betrayal and hurt and anger day after day. So all of those reductions in problems and potential problems can improve our sense of psychological well-being as well as reduce our risk of developing a mental health disorder. Eventually, making a decision to forgive and experiencing emotional forgiveness can even reduce the chances that you might develop a serious physical problem. The physical problems that many people develop as a result of chronic unforgiveness, the most frequent are generally cardiovascular problems, that is, problems in high blood pressure, in hypertension, in risk for stroke, in heart attacks or cardio infarctions. So forgiving can help us reduce that risk of those cardiovascular problems. But actually, forgiveness can reduce the likelihood that we develop problems in almost every system of the body. It helps, if we forgive, it helps our immune system function better. It helps our gastrointestinal system so that we're not as at risk for things like ulcers or digestive disorders. It actually can help prevent our brain from shrinking. When we are unforgiving, that will affect the size of a part of our brain that creates memories, called the hippocampus. So by forgiving, we prevent our brain from shrinking, and people have found at some points that 25% of our hippocampus, the size of our hippocampus, has been lost when we are chronically unforgiving. So forgiveness then is good for you in many ways. It's good for your physical health, your mental health, your relationships, even your spiritual health. You can forgive offenses and harms that you've experienced if you wish to do so. You don't have to forgive. Forgiveness is a choice that you can make, but it is possible. So when we experience an injustice, an offense against us, then we create what we call an injustice gap, a sense of injustice. Sometimes that gap is very large and I have this large sense of injustice. Sometimes that gap is small and I have a small sense of injustice. Large gaps are very hard to deal with. The small gaps are easier to deal with. So what we do is we kind of keep a computer going in our mind, and we keep adjusting the size of that injustice gap depending on what happens. If a person refuses to take responsibility for the wrong that they've done to us, that increases our injustice gap. If the person does take responsibility and in fact apologizes and asks if they can make something up to us, each of those reduces the size of that injustice gap. So we keep this mental computer going and keep adjusting the size of the injustice gap, making it harder or easier to forgive depending on what happens out in our relationships. So if you've had one of those hard-to-handle hurts, then you have lots of good ways to reduce the size of the injustice gap. And you can make it easier to forgive, or if we make bad choices, make it harder to forgive. So let me just name a few of those ways that we can reduce the amount of injustice that we feel. The first of those is justice. That may be seeing justice done. We see a person get brought to trial for what they did, get convicted, go to jail. So each of those would reduce the injustice gap because we see justice happening. But sometimes justice doesn't happen in the system. Sometimes it just happens because a person experiences the natural consequences of the wrong that they've done. I had a person once, I was riding my bicycle and this person ran me off the road, and then I was frustrated and I made a frustrated gesture at the person, and the person stopped his truck, waited for my bicycle to approach, and then as we drove side by side with me, not looking at him, he made a rude gesture at me. Well, I was very offended by this, but he sped off up the hill, and when I got to the top of the hill, there he was parked by the side of the road. However, there was a policeman that was writing him a ticket, a citation for his speeding. Suddenly, I had no sense of injustice toward this guy because he had got the natural consequences of his behavior. So seeing justice done or seeing a person experience justice in some way is a way that we can reduce the size of the injustice gap. Another way that we can reduce the size of the injustice gap is to turn the matter over to God. Now, some people turn the matter over to God expecting that God is going to impose divine justice or God's justice on this person. It's going to punish them. But other people can just turn the matter over to God because they're just releasing it to God. They're just turning it loose. This is not my problem. This is God's problem. So besides seeing justice done and turning the matter over to God, there are still other ways that we can reduce the size of the injustice gap. One of those is to just decide that we're going to just tolerate this. I'm just going to put up with it. Now, I may grumble a lot about this, and so this doesn't usually totally decrease the amount of injustice that I feel by a lot, but tolerating it does reduce it to some degree. Now, perhaps a little better than tolerating it is forbearance. If I decide to forbear, what I do is I decide to put up with this injustice that was done to me, but I do so for a good reason, and that is so that I don't create more disharmony in the group. So this is better than just tolerating because I now have something positive I'm expecting to come out of this, and that is, a sense of maintaining group peace. Now, a third way that's related to tolerating and forbearing is accepting. So accepting is probably even better than forbearing because with acceptance, I just say, okay, life is too short to deal with this. I am just going to put this behind me. I'm just going to move on. Now, that doesn't always keep the matter from coming back to me, but it very often keeps the matter from coming back, and it keeps my emotions less stirred up than either tolerating or sometimes forbearing. So I can do all of those. I can see justice done. I can turn it over to God. I can tolerate. I can forbear. I can accept and move on with my life. And each of those may reduce the amount of injustice that I feel is in this event that I'm trying to forgive. But I can also forgive. I can mix and match all of those, any of them that work for me, with forgiveness. So, how do we forgive? How do we make that decision to forgive? How do we experience that emotional forgiveness? Well, there are some very good programs to help us do this, quite a number of good ones. And one of those is a program that I developed called Reach Forgiveness. Now, this is free and available to anyone by way of workbooks that take about 2 or 3 hours to work through. You could get access to these free workbooks if you speak English by going to my website, www.evworthington, that's E-V Worthington, W-O-R-T-H-I-N-G-T-O-N, -forgiveness.com, or Andrea has created a set of resources in Spanish that you can access, and she can tell you how to get access to her website. Other ways that we might be helped to forgive are to consult a good close friend of ours who might help us to forgive, or maybe a family member who's close to us, or maybe a clergy member or a counselor or someone with a reputation for helping. So it's my sincere hope that you will take advantage of this campaign to raise people's awareness about forgiveness in Colombia that Andrea is sponsoring, and that you will come away from that campaign with at least 3 things. So the first thing to come away with is that there are 2 types of forgiveness: making a decision to treat the other person better, and experiencing emotional forgiveness, maybe by going through that Reach Forgiveness model or some other program to create emotional forgiveness. The second thing to come away with is that if you are able to forgive, you get a lot out of it, as well as blessing the person who you are forgiving. So you can end up with better relationships, better mental health, better psychological well-being, and better physical well-being and physical health. So you can benefit from forgiving people too. And the third thing to get out of this is that you can get free help, cost-free help, by going to either my website if you speak English or Andrea's website and using and take advantage of the resources that are there, and maybe even groups at your local community or church. Les deseo lo mejor, mis amigos colombianos. Que vayas con Dios. Thank you.